Hello folks, welcome to another SACPA session. And today SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the land of the Blackfoot people and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And we pay respect to their past, present and future cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship to the land. SACPA commits to assist reconciliation efforts by raising awareness of the ways past and present injustices can be reconciled. SACPA also likes to thank University of Lethbridge, Shaw Spotlight and the Lethbridge Herald for their continuing support that we receive from them. Today, we're very happy to have with us Dr. David Finch. Dr. David Finch holds a PhD in management and is an active educator, scholar, and practitioner. He currently holds several academic appointments, including as a professor at Mount Royal University's Bissett School of Business, a visiting fellow at the Henley Business School at the University of Reading in the UK, and the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. As a senior fellow at the Institute of Community Prosperity, Dr. Finch leads the Institute's CityXLab. This lab explores the intersection between a city's learning, creative and active experiences, and its ability to attract and develop and retain human capital. Dr. Finch, thank you for joining us today, and I very much look forward, and I think we all look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Annalise, and I look forward to this. As you can see, what we're going to talk about today is the risk and the arguably increasing risk of young people, young talent exiting the province. And we've been studying this issue for about the last 14 months, and I'm just going to provide a summary of some of the key themes that have emerged and some of the key actions that we can all take. So Annalise, if you want to move to the next slide. Perfect. So this is a slide of Singapore, and the next slide is a slide of Pittsburgh. When you look at the nature of community and the nature of cities and their history and their how they emerged and where they emerged, often over millennia, the origin of cities are tied to proximity to natural resources. Those natural resources may range from minerals to oil and gas to trade routes. And cities like Pittsburgh and Singapore are examples of those. Obviously, so is Calgary. What's changed dramatically in the last 20 years, Annalise, if you want to flip to the next slide, is a city's competitive advantage, a community's competitive advantage, where there's the urban rule is now defined by her. And if next slide, or defined by him. This is about human capital. And moving on to the next slide, it's about a region's ability to attract, retain, develop, and mobilize human capital. Obviously, the province of Alberta has had historical access to natural resources, and that has what stimulated its growth in the last 100 plus years, whether it be a combination of agriculture, or access to energy and fossil fuel products and other products. And we've seen a dramatic change where it's about the ability to harness human capital as opposed to natural capital. And at least we want to move to the next slide. This is just a summary of what we've been doing over the last year. It started, one thing I'm a believer of is this topic is about young people, and therefore it's fundamentally really must engage young people in having to solve the fundamental issue we're dealing with. So it actually kicked off in the fall of 2020, where we brought together a team of 50 young people to study this issue and look at this issue in conjunction with our partners at the Canada West Foundation and Calgary Economic Development. We were specifically at that point looking at the scale and scope of Calgary. So I'm going to talk about some Calgary unique dynamics through the presentation, but also some broader data that we've studied since then. That led to a series of papers that were released in Q1 of this year, and a series of panels we hosted that looked at the issue and the risk of talent migration, specifically from Calgary, and the drivers of it and potential activities that we can do to mitigate and ideally invert it and to drive Calgary and Alberta back to a net gain of young talent. As we started working on that project, the federal government became very interested in conjunction with our partners at the other economic development agencies in the province and the province of Alberta, and developed a joint team between the CityXLab at Mount Royal, the Canada West Foundation, and our partners at the Stone Olafson, a research firm based in Calgary. And what we've been doing is conducting a multi-level research study that started in the spring, is ongoing, and will be completed, and a report will be then submitted to our partners later at the end of this year. And that really looks at the issue from a holistic perspective. It involved a series of 12 workshops of young people from across the province, people who are living in the province and people who have left Alberta. So we wanted to get the views of young people to really understand in depth the drivers or their current mindset around the issue. That was then complemented by a national study that ran in June of this year, in which we studied data from Vancouver, across Alberta, southern, central, northern Alberta, as well as large samples in both Calgary and Edmonton, Toronto, and Kitchener-Waterloo. Where this is really important is if we don't have data from other jurisdictions, we have no baseline. And the challenge with most of the data that existed on this issue to date is it was isolated. So there was either no comparable data from other jurisdictions or there was no longitudinal data. So we couldn't track trends. And looking at this more holistically was critical. The next element of the study is we then had a team of students do whole social media sentiment analysis that was running from May to September. We were trying to mine social media to understand, does it triangulate some of the findings that were coming from the community workshops as well as through the survey. That then led to another fall engagement of 50 additional students who spent 6 weeks with the raw data that we gave them to identify and make recommendations on what we should do. And the composite of all these activities will be the final report going forward at the end of the year. You're going to get a sneak preview of some of the data and some of the insights. If you could flip to the next slide, Annalise. I'm a marketing prof, and as a marketing prof, this is how I pursue and look at this issue. It's fundamentally a purchasing decision, and I would argue, and the research certainly support that place, whether it be a city, a region, or community, is life's most complex purchasing decision. It's something that we invest in and take very seriously because obviously it has a huge impact. If you could flip to the next slide. So, is there a problem when it comes to Alberta being a preferred product of choice? What this chart shows is migration over the last 50 years. Obviously, if you look at the trend line over 50 years, has been historically the net gainer. It has been the absolutely single largest province in regards to the attraction of young people for a variety of different reasons over the last 50 years. If you look at the last 5 years, that has dropped off dramatically to a trickle. But if you look at the last 1 year, we've now moved, meaning we're bleeding more young people. Young people in this study is defined as 18 to 29-year-olds, than we are gaining. And the question is why and what can we do about it? And Annalise, if you could move to the next slide. So this is forward-looking data associated with the study we looked at, and I clustered the data in 3 different regions. One is rural Alberta, one is big city Alberta, so that's Calgary and Edmonton, and the other is what I call Can Metro. That's Vancouver and Toronto combined. What the PMI is a provincial mobility intention score. So is there a high intention? The red is what we're interested in, of these individuals leaving the province within the next 3 to 5 years. And that was asked in a variety of different ways quantitatively. As you can see, about 36% of those in rural Alberta state a very high intent of leaving the province within the next 3 to 5 years. Alberta, big cities, it sits at 51% high mobility intention. So 50% of young people in that cohort between age 18 and 29 state an intention to leave the province within 5 years in both Calgary and Edmonton. And then the Can Metro gives us the baseline. So it says, you know what, there's a life stage dimension here as well. This is a time for exploration. So even if people are sitting in Vancouver and Toronto, they may love their life. Even a third of those people state their intention of leaving their province within the next 3 to 5 years. So that baseline is critical because there is a life stage dimension that we have to acknowledge. And what I always emphasize is also encourage. I certainly encourage all my students to explore and move beyond their comfort zone, which often involves moving out of their community and out of their province, because perspective and context is everything. And therefore, going out and exploring the world is a wonderful thing. Not creating any robust mechanism to bring them home after they've had those incredible experiences is one of the challenges we're facing. And Elise, if you want to move ahead. So this slide is just simply, there's no surprises here. This is a rating of the importance of those quote unquote features and benefits, my marketing talk, around what people look for when they want to buy a community. The leading is safe and clean. I don't want to live a place that's dirty or a place I'm going to get killed. Like there's some logic and obviousness to many of these. You'll see the blue coding is tied to issues tied to economics. The green is tied to what I call the foundational element. So that includes issues around obviously safety, cleanliness, transportation, in and out of access to the city. And then a critical one I'll be certainly talking to is the nature of an inclusive and welcoming community. Is absolutely table stakes amongst this age cohort. And it's very different than other data we've seen in the past. You'll see the red areas are what I call vibrancy indicators. So access to natural areas, access to entertainment and restaurants. And then the blue is tied to, again, economics, but you'll see there's dimensions tied to networking and education, which are inherently tied to economics. There's nothing surprising here. These are quite consistent jurisdictionally across the country. They're globally very consistent. And there's not a dramatic change demographically or socioeconomically across many of these things. If you could move ahead, Annalise. The challenge with that purchasing model is just the shopping list. It doesn't allow us to activate much because, making a priority to have a clean and safe city isn't really a strategy. It doesn't matter if you're 50 or 15; those are foundational. What we've developed in this study is what we call a purchasing model for place. I won't have time to go, into in excessive detail, but it's a complex model. On the left-hand side are factors that are motivators and incentives, so they're intrinsic to an individual. What about the economic factors in life? That could be tied to employment. It could be tied to learning. It could be tied to affordability. What about other dimensions of place, amenities, vibrancy, active experience, transportation? And then below that, of course, is people. Relationships are critical and provide a tether for many people to a community and city. Often, it also conflicts with their own personal wishes. They are conflicted whether they want to move to another place for a career or other opportunities, but it involves potentially leaving friends and family. Mediating factors at the top talk about the factors that start influencing a perception of the product. So that could be media, networks, social networks, the level of familiarity you had to have with the product, or in this place, in this context, the place. Have you been there before? Do you know what firsthand experience? What was that experience like? And then, of course, reputation. Reputation mediates perception of the destination or our current place. Below it is contextual factors at the individual level, which are absolutely critical. So that's the factors that contribute, inform, and influence how we form attitudes and ultimately triggers behaviors. So socioeconomic factors are fairly significant. Personal values, which is something amongst this cohort we need to be very cognizant of. How the current location geographically influences attitudes, proximity, and values, because obviously they condition to a great extent, people's values. And then a family mobility is a factor we built into the study. So looking at um, families and their history of movement. So mobility in parts of Canada. Has somebody moved here? Somebody's parents moved here from Ontario or Vancouver. How does that influence their opinion? Are they first generation Canadians? So their parents moved here from out of Canada. How does that then form their and influence their opinion? And on the right are what we call the dependent variable, and that's mobility and tension. So in this study, we looked at three factors: provincial mobility and tension, community mobility intention. So that is staying within a province or region, but leaving the current community you're in. And the third is the relocation of destination. So I want to move to a Vancouver as opposed to wanting to move to a Toronto. So we looked at all these factors in our study. And at least if you want to move ahead. So one of the things as a marketer, and again, just introducing the complexity, there no need to read into this other than the fact that what marketers have learned over the last 2 decades is that we've shifted from a transactional view of how we work with our customers and build relationships with our customers. And what we look at a relationship as far more of a journey. And so, what we have the young people do is they mapped journeys out. They mapped a whole series of journeys that started as early as elementary school and map out how opinions are formed in elementary school, how they're starting to be solidified in middle school, right through high school. We then define what we call a moment of truth. The first moment of truth is an off ramp at the end of high school in which people have then a decision. Do I move? Do I stay? Do I go? Why am I going? Am I going to go work outside the province, go to school outside the province? If they stay in the province, say potentially pursuing post secondary education, the next moment of truth is at the end of post secondary. So 2 to 4 years later, there's another off ramp. It's what we call a moment of truth, too, in which what at that point, what they're looking at is when I'm graduating, do I stay here? Do I go? Where's the employment in my field? What are my hopes and dreams professionally? Do I pursue those inside or outside of the province? That moves on to the third moment of truth. The third moment of truth is somewhere between 6 and 10 years after post secondary education, and that's when people start thinking about settling. Do I want to, in fact, raise a family where I currently am? Can I afford to live here? Is this going to be the place I want to see my career professionally? Those are the three moments of truth that last over that first kind of 15 years. And what we certainly recommend is that going deep and understanding this journey is where, in fact, we can start having implications. Simply trying to hit them at a point, a moment of truth at in grade 12 and fourth university, it's far too late. Opinions and attitudes have been formed, and that intervention is just too late. We can look at any of those experiences. If you cancel your cell phone service, your cable company, um, it's very difficult for those companies to save you as you're canceling that business because there's years of factors that contributed to your dissatisfaction. And guess what? There's always another company that will want to serve you. In this case, there's many other provinces and regions across the country that would love to have our young people. And at least if you want to move ahead. So I'm just going to show a few slides here of how moments of truth start influencing opinions and attitudes. So you start looking at these three different age cohorts: 18 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 to 45. And these are just some simple factors we pulled out. Look at the red line, which is the influence of others. So there is a tipping point contagion happening here. When young people start seeing friends move, there's an acceleration factor happening. It declines fairly significantly as you get older because you've got other factors. Once you're in your 30s, it might be professionally, it might be a family, it might be other factors that a friend leaving is less influential. And then you start looking at the gray and the blue. The gray is the likelihood of relocating to another province. Blue is relocating communities. Again, we start seeing how the moment of truth, that life stage, starts changing intention to potentially leave their community or their province. At least on the next slide. So I like to talk about the intersection of place, values, and identity. And this is just a couple examples. I've just used transit and a question we asked about the role of place as a reflection of the individual. This issue of social identity is absolutely dominant amongst young people. They no longer look at it as a place as simply a place. A place is a projection of themselves, and therefore the place must in fact embed their own values. So what you're looking at here as an example is how, for example, the importance of public transit will vary. For example, in this one, rural Alberta is a very low importance, right? But in other jurisdictions like Toronto, it's foundational. The young people that are based there. Place says a lot about you. So if you look at Vancouver and Toronto there, these are people in which they are the city and their community is highly intertwined with their own identity. In fact, you look at the data, they do not view themselves as people from Ontario. They do not view themselves as people from BC. They are Vancouverites. They are Torontonians. They don't even view themselves as Canadians because, first and foremost, they're Torontonians and Vancouverites. That idea of city identity is critical. It's a critical opportunity, but it's also a critical risk. If you want to move to the next slide, here's just a few examples that, again, additional questions I just want to pull out just to show the variance. So I love where I live. So in Alberta, that's a score of 76 percent who agreed with that point. Non-Alberta, it's 85. This actually, in fact, varies a lot of the variance. In places like Toronto and Vancouver, it's north of 90%. And then in parts of rural Alberta, it's into the 50% range. So again, if we look at this from a product perspective, 90% of my customers saying they love my product is a wonderful place to be. 50% of my customers saying they love my product, I start getting scared because they will start shopping for alternatives. Next thing, where you live says a lot about you. Again, fairly significant variance. Rural Alberta is a very low consideration that place is a projection of them individually. In large urban areas, place says everything, as I've said before. And you'll see the notation here about the social influence. Again, you've got to look at this very uniquely, both influenced by place as well as influenced by age. And then those last points is around, I would call a coercive factor. A coercive factor is I live somewhere only because of a job. This is an area that we should be concerned about because this is an area specifically in parts of rural Alberta. Northern Alberta specifically is the lowest data point in the study, in which people live in Northern Alberta. A majority live in Northern Alberta only because of employment reasons. That creates significant vulnerability for any decision maker. In other areas, we see less of that inclination, and that also varies by age as well. Annalise? Excellent. Just some additional, I just wanted to pull out one of the slides here. This is the issue of how people self-identify. And I wanted just to show the Southern Alberta data on this one to give you a sense on the fluctuation there. In rural Alberta as a whole, there is a strong provincial identity. So people, first and foremost, as the data shows here, view themselves as Albertans. When you move into Calgary and Edmonton, Calgary specifically, we are far closer, as you'll see, to Toronto, who view ourselves as Calgarians, not Albertans. And then we start to, in fact, slice that even further. Again, this is an opportunity, but it's also a risk as well, because obviously, the regional identity provincially has significant influence on attitude formation, and other jurisdictions and I'll pull out Austin, Texas, Berlin, Tasmania, as jurisdictions that have made significant investment in positioning the city or the community or region separate from the political entity of the state or the province, and that then has insulated them from any ebbs and flows on the political front. And this is an issue that we see here that is fairly consistent. Good to go ahead to the next slide, Annalise. This is a question we asked around what I call perception is reality. And this is by far the most significant factor we need to be concerned about as a province. We've looked at multiple data points over a variety of different studies around the facts versus the perception, or the perception versus reality. And the gap at this age group is dramatic. And again, that's not their fault. As a marketer, I never blame a customer if they misunderstood the value of my product. That is all on me. What this is a text feedback in our study of keywords people thought of, a sentiment they thought of when they thought of Alberta. So we cluster these in a variety of areas. You look at the black is when people think of Alberta, they think oil and gas. Okay, you sit there and see the black and how that varies by region. Green is issues around, I think of open prairies, I think of the mountains, I think of the rivers, I think of skiing, hiking. That's the green. The blue is, I think, conservative. So again, we're going to interpret this as small c conservatism when they think of the region. And again, what I find interesting here is some of the variants we become, it's the Alberta data often that is very unique, because we sit there and go, oh, the people in Vancouver and Toronto don't understand us. My take on this data is, in fact, it's many Albertans that don't understand ourselves. It's Calgarians projecting stereotypes in rural Alberta. It's rural Albertans projecting stereotypes in urban Alberta. And that misinformation starts aggregating and amplifying the risk. The red is intolerance. Themes around intolerance is one of the dominant factors. Again, where's this sit around concerns about intolerance? It's ourselves looking in the mirror. It's rural Alberta, it's Edmonton and Calgary that are more likely to say we are rednecks. It's more likely to say we are intolerant. Far more likely than anyone in Toronto or Vancouver. And the last elements are other positive and negative or neutral trends or other keywords. This issue really starts framing around the perception of how people see themselves when they think of Alberta, and a sense of belonging. Do these values, does this identity align with me? So if we could move to the next slide. So one of the exercises I ran in the focus group, to start off the focus group, was I asked all the 92 people in the focus groups to start by drawing a picture of an Albertan. Okay, it was universal. 90 of the 92 drew a picture of a cowboy, middle-aged cowboy, white, and often a pickup truck. Some people might throw an oil wall behind them, or maybe a pair of skis, but it was universal. But here's the thing. These were all young people under the age of 30. 30% of them were racialized. They don't see themselves as an Albertan. And so it's not surprising when they project of what an Albertan is. They don't project themselves. They project their parents or other people that are stereotypical. That is problematic because they don't see themselves as belonging in this province. We could move to the next slide. As a similar exercise, what I would ask individuals to reflect on is the proportion of employment tied to oil and gas. And so I would do a poll, very informal, to stimulate a conversation across these focus groups. And I would ask them, what percentage of employment is directly result of oil and gas, the oil and gas sector, period. The responses range from 40 to 70%. 40 to 70% of all employment in the province, young people projected to be part of the oil and gas sector. The answer is less than 7%. So when you look at the values of this sector, specifically around fossil fuels, the overwhelming majority want nothing to do with fossil fuel. The terminology I've seen most often is that's my parents' fuel. Climate and the environment is a core value to them. And therefore, if they think 70% of employment is tied to something that challenges their core values, is it surprising they want to go to Toronto or Vancouver? Not at all. But it doesn't reflect the reality of the opportunities. Flipping to the next slide, and I'll be wrapping up here shortly. This is a Calgary study we did earlier this year as part of the first wave that looked at a variety of different what we call brand attributes associated with the city. We coded them versus fact. So we call that authenticity, and then we coded against three different audiences. So Calgarians' perception of it, the external reputation. So those are people outside of Alberta, and then specifically we then isolated young people. And what we found, and I'll show the next slide, there is a huge gap between fact around issues of diversity, around issues of diverse career opportunities, around issues associated with belonging and so forth, and reality. And this gap is significant. And the next slide, if you could move ahead, shows this gap. In fact, what it shows is that they believe of the key attributes of the city. That was supposed to be young talent. Young talent think is about a third of it is true and 70% of it is is fictional or aspirational. And if you look at the other Calgarians, call it their parents, they think there's a much a tighter bridge between brand attributes of the city and fact. Brands can often have an aspirational dimension, but if you look at the top one, they basically believe that many of those attributes are a myth. Alberta, and specifically Calgary, is not a diverse or welcoming community. They think that's aspirational, not fact, and the data certainly would challenge that. If you could, go ahead. So what we've done, and I'm going to roll through. I'm just going to hit some key strategic pillars that we're framing out. The first one is be targeted. So what we've done as part of this study is, like any good marketer, there's no such thing as an Albertan. There's certainly no such thing as a young Albertan. In fact, there are many types of Albertans. They're driven and motivated by a variety of different factors. So what we've identified here are 7 key segments that have very unique attributes, very unique motivations, very unique influencers or mediators, are framed by a variety of different moderating factors that lead to different outcomes. And therefore, be targeted is we cannot just say, oh, you're 20 years old, you must be like this. That is not the case under any circumstances. The more generic we create it, the more risk we create. Next slide, Annalise. What this is showing the segments, and I won't again go from career movers to nature lovers to big city bound. There's obviously we've got a variety of segments that incorporate rural Alberta, and that is the composition of the population. So in the blue, those are people who live in rural Alberta, and so there's a proportion of rural Alberta in what we call career movers. They're moving because of careers. Big Alberta, big city bound are specifically a cohort of individuals with a high probability of leaving rural Alberta and moving to urban Alberta. Rural Alberta movers is also a segment of people who have intentionality of leaving the province totally. So again, looking at these strategically and understanding factors behind them is critical. Annalise, next slide. Strategy 2 is this idea of looking at our young people in more of with a journey mindset, and engage them far earlier. So we recommend the engagement start no later than grade 10. We believe there's 3 fantastic years in which we can build and embed young people in their community. And that can be the first bullet talks about focus on the future. We do not have to talk about the oil and gas sector to these people. They are fully aware of the opportunities within the energy sector in this province. So profiling those opportunities is not required. It's there just by the nature of the scope and size of it. What they're not aware of are the incredible opportunities in ag tech, biotech, in the other growth sectors. Those are the opportunities that we can introduce them at a young age to start creating that sense of exploration, discovery that's available to them. Again, start in high school. This should start universally across the province by repositioning what we call the career and life management curriculum as really an opportunity for discovery in Alberta. Third element is we call scaffold experiential learning. This would run from right through high school, right through post-secondary, in which we in fact embed young people's learning in their own communities. I always say it's far more difficult to just pick up and leave if you spent 2 or 3 summers working with a small business in your community, working with people and making a difference to their lives. It becomes more home for you at that point. And the last one is across all these is the ability to seed professional capital. The reality is, individuals' competencies are mobile, but networks are not. So if I've spent 3 to 5 years through high school and post secondary building a professional social network, picking up and moving to Toronto or Vancouver is stranded capital. And it becomes far more difficult at that point. If I've got people that are looking out for me, opening doors, are mentors for me. Right now, that is non-existent for many of these students. Moving ahead, and I'm just winding down here. This issue is huge. Diversity is our strength, I call it. Alberta cannot just simply be good in the issue of perceptions of inclusiveness and well-being. We need to be the best because we're dealing, as you saw in the data, from a deficit. There's a perception both internal to Alberta and outside of Alberta that there are significant cohorts of the province that are intolerant, and that there's to a great extent that is a projection and a stereotype, and therefore we cannot be simply good. We need to lead. We need to modernize governance structures that then to reflect the communities we're in. A third of the Calgary's population are racialized, and if you look at board composition across even our public sector boards, they're not remotely representative of the communities that we're in. This is a problem. This is a problem because if you're not influencing and leading and governing your community, you don't have a sense of ownership of that community. And the last element is we cannot be timid. We need to confront intolerance head on. We need to be intolerant about intolerance. And this is an area that we need to deal with at both the local level and the provincial level, because it is what I call this is the most significant economic risk facing our province is a perception of intolerance, and it will drive people of all ages, but specifically this age cohort, out of the province. And the last one is an area that certainly I'm interested in is the role of city or region reputation. Right now, we defer to a great extent to the provincial reputation. We are all framed by the perception of Alberta and how that bleeds positively or negatively down to our local communities. In some contexts, it can be an asset. In other contexts, frankly, amongst this cohort, it's a liability. Without actually controlling our own destination, we are going to be vulnerable to the ebbs and flows of the provincial identity. And you can look no further than Texas to say the exposure of a city like Austin, which is a liberal progressive city, and some of the current activities at the state level there, that will have a massive negative impact on the ability for Austin and companies based in Austin to attract talent to that city because of the state level identity and state level issues. Last one is accountability, and I'm just going to wind it up here, but accountability is about right now, I always say, we say talent's our most important asset, but we have absolutely no one accountable for it. Certainly recommend establishing what I call a chief talent officer at the provincial level, as well as at the local levels, and those people will be fully accountable for harmonizing and mobilizing all the assets and focusing on the ability to grow our talent base. Right now, it's fragmented. And there's no accountability for this. And this, for me, is one of the greatest opportunities to start harnessing all the assets we do have. On that end, I'll thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was wonderful. We've got quite a few questions in the queue, so I'm just going to jump right in. Laurie Schultz, thank you, David, for your presentation. To what extent, if any, do the cutbacks in healthcare, post-secondary and education by the Alberta government influence young people to stay or leave Alberta?
I would say The thing is, it sits more at a macro level because it represents the prioritization of values of certain public policy. And so, what we see amongst young people, specifically in the area of education, this is personal to them. So, cutbacks that they're feeling in real time in regards to class sizes, program availability, and so forth, it just signals we don't care about you. You're not important to us. And alternatives will become available, certainly when you start looking at the ability for graduate schools across the country have recognized this. And what they are able to do is look at targeting Alberta high graduating students out of post secondary for graduate programs, scale up the bursaries and scholarships because they know that Albertan institutions cannot respond in a similar mindset. So we're starting to see a bleed of the best and the brightest graduates just going outside the province because of funding made available by other jurisdictions.
Our next question comes from Mark Goodall. Do you consider differences in views of new arrivals versus first, second, third generation youth?
Yeah, so we in fact, the study empirically looked at that issue of generation. So we looked at people that moved from other parts of Canada to Alberta, people that have moved from outside the country to Alberta, and people who have lived in their current community for a period of time. I'm challenged by, one of the things that I always emphasize, and it's a subtle issue, but we talk about, I'm a born and bred Albertan. I'm a third generation Albertan. Just be very clear, that's exclusionary language because that is suggesting that my family's just been here 10 years. I'm not a real Albertan. You may not mean it that way, but that is how it's interpreted. And it's exclusionary. So I certainly, I'm originally from Alberta. I've been here 27 years. I'm not a born and bred Albertan, but I can't ever think of being in Ontario and somebody saying, I'm a born and bred Torontonian. They don't say that, but we do it here. And we do it here because there's an element of pride, which is positive. But you have to remember it's also exclusionary because it starts tiering what an Albertan is. And if I'm not a real Albertan, maybe I'll go somewhere else that I'm valued.
Next question is from Knut Peterson. As climate change accelerates, how do you see major disruptions, as we now see in BC, play into where people want to live? Will such disasters have long-term effects on living desirably?
No question about it. Whether it be issues tied to climate change, whether it be the pandemic, the very nature of place is changing. Technology is enabling a whole bunch of different access in regards to how we can live and play and work in different locations. Just stepping to the pandemic, we in fact did look at the issue of remote work to see if that was a significant factor. It's a non-issue with this group. It's really interesting. So we think of young people as being the ones that I would love to sit in the mountains and hang out. In fact, they're very social. The thought of them wanting to work remotely at that early stage in their career, it doesn't exist. They, in fact, want to be in an office with their peers. They want to be with mentors. They want to be a place they can coach, which is an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity to sell those points to us before they move out and live in rural BC by themselves. In the issue of climate change, absolutely. That is in that whole concept of the stability of a place, whether it be tied to climate impacts or otherwise, is a significant part of the factor. That being said, when you look at that shopping list, it actually rates relatively low in regards to how it influences people's purchasing decisions. That whole area is really outside of a jurisdictional control, but certainly it will impact anyone's decision. If you've spent any time in BC this summer, you realize living in a place that's smoky is not actually a very pleasant experience.
Bev Mundell, did you see a relationship between a tax on and loss of medical doctors and nurses this past year and the need to move out of the province this year?
No, but all these things contribute to a narrative, and the stories matter, right? So what we were able to observe is the compounding elements of these narratives of young people leaving, doctors leaving, other professionals leaving. All they start creating a perception that we live in an undesirable place, and that specifically we become exposed in that 18 to 24-year-old cohort. People want to live in a place that's desirable, right? And when we look at the Vancouver data and Toronto data is fascinating because my hypothesis was this: who the hell wants to live in a place where the entry price point for a condo is $1 million and they have no hope in hell of ever buying a home, ever, right? I thought this issue of affordability was going to, in fact, demonstrate a low level of uh, a low level of love, call it, for Toronto and Vancouver. In fact, it was inverted. It was the exact opposite. What we saw in the research was people in Toronto, when they look at affordability, or people in Vancouver, they look at affordability, it's a signal that they live in a place that everyone else in the world wants to live in, and they can't. So it starts projecting, in fact, embedding them tighter into the community. Sure, they're never going to buy a home, but in the focus groups we ran, in which we had a lot of Albertans in Vancouver in this, and they're like, I don't need a white picket fence and living in Lethbridge like when I grew up. I'm content with a 400 square foot apartment in downtown Vancouver because I live in the best place in the world. That's a trade-off that we saw consistently in both the focus groups as well as in the survey data.
Bev Mundell has another question. Do you present this data to our current government to help them see what they need to change?
Yeah, so the current government, the government of Alberta, is part of the task force. The task force is being led by the federal government because they're funding this research through Western economic diversification, but it involves many departments at the provincial level as well as municipal and regional level. I would emphasize, part of this is about taking local community control. We spend too much time deferring to other jurisdictions, whether it be at a local level, saying that's not in my breadbasket, it's the provincial responsibility, or the province saying it's the federal responsibility. That still doesn't get anything done. We really have to look at what we can do at a local level and mitigate potential risks at other jurisdictions and ideally harmonize with them. But there's so much we can do at a local level to really have impact.
Bev Mundell's third question. She's on a roll, Evis. Even if oil and gas are only 7% of our economy, fossil fuels are pushing climate change. So their negative impact pushes perceptions of a province/government that's out of step with reality. Your comment, please.
Absolutely. I've got multiple studies that show exactly that. So step one is they don't want to work in the sector. Step two is they don't want to be in a place associated with the sector, right? So this is why you're starting to see, Mayor Gondek here in Calgary as an example. I've had the pleasure of working with Jody in the past. She's a faculty member at U of C. It's not an accident that one of the first activities of the new city council in Calgary was to declare a climate emergency. That is a clear signal. We are taking this seriously. We're going to act on this. That's an example of we can't just play nice anymore. We need to get ahead of this, both from a narrative perspective and from a factual perspective. And if we can, the young people want to be part of the solution. They want to be part of that transition and transformation, right? So it's going to be a phased transition of the economy overall. They want to be part of that. They do not want to be part of the quote unquote fossil fuel economy, and we're going to have to manage that transition accordingly.
Leona Jacobs, how does working remotely, and then in brackets a career factor, figure into the retention or not of young people?
Again, like I said, at that early career stage, it actually is not a desirable path for many young people. Some of us who are older Working remote is fantastic because we have our social capital, we have our professional capital, we've got our career and our networks in place. But at that age, you're growing through osmosis, and therefore, what we saw in the data is working remote is not something that appeals to a lot of young people. We actually looked at this. There's a separate study that looked at the potential of Alberta being a beneficiary of the ability of recruiting people from other jurisdictions across North America into Alberta if you're mid-career and you want to sit in the Rocky Mountains and sit in Bidger Creek or sit and ski. And we saw very little appeal to that. Alberta is not top of mind for many Canadian jurisdictions and certainly Americans. It's a non-starter of becoming a hub for a volume, at least, of remote workers.
Next question comes from Mark Goodall. To what extent do you think the current government's rhetoric regarding the unfair equalization situation, anti-Quebec statements, etc., is affecting the province's youth?
People want to be part of a team, and this is more anecdotal more than anything. One of the things we struggled with in looking at this data, and we tried to tease out through the qualitative research, was this idea of when they say conservative, small c conservative, is that derogatory? Are they doing it in a manner in which that is negative, not neutral or positive? And I think young people, this is anecdotally my interpretation, young people don't use conservative in a positive way. So when we start seeing that blue in that chart of when they think of Alberta, they think of conservative, that means it's conservative means it's not progressive. Right? So there's progressive and there's regressive. And if that large proportion of young people sit there and go, place is too conservative for me, that is particularly bleeding, will lead to a perception that the current government or the values of the province do not align with my values. Now, what I emphasize is the government of Alberta, regardless of where it sits on the political spectrum, is not Alberta. And we often interpret the government of Alberta as in fact the province. And the more we can do to detach our own identity from the political seasonality and have an identity that's apolitical is only positive. Right now, I think it's become very politicized one way or the other, and that's not a positive thing for our province at all, regardless of age or desires.
Sorry, I got a little lost here in the queue. Let me just Laura Schultz, can you comment on how the gig economy plays in young people's decision to migrate?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we've just completed actually a study of the Calgary gig economy, specifically marketing and communications. So it's tied to the space that you're all in, and started looking at career pathways at a variety of different life stages and from a variety of different functional parts of the economy. Many people at a young age aspire for that level of independence. What they don't appreciate, and I can speak to my own students, is the factors that require you to be successful in a gig economy, which is often about networks and business development. You've got to be able to monetize networks and be able to be very good in business development, to be able to monetize and become successful in the gig economy. I certainly advise my students, being your own boss is fantastic, but you probably have to spend 10 years building that professional capital and expertise and evidence of your value before you can start to be able to effectively become your own boss, whether that be as a solopreneur or setting up your own agency or small business. That's just simply because you need a base level of work. At that early age, call it early 20s, the only value proposition you often bring is you're cheap and inexpensive. And that is not a winning strategy for many people.
Sorry, Leona. Next question is from Leona Jacobs. I did get lost in the queue, so I missed her. My apologies. When you spoke earlier about the exclusionary language, I thought of social conservatism. I'm assuming this is buried into the concept of tolerance or lack of. What's social conservatism considered?
Uh, not explicitly. We unpacked a variety of different values associated with the drivers and motivations of young people. So we did not move into specific areas associated with social conservatism. It did emerge in some of the focus groups, though. I can tell you, because those were much more open and freewheeling, and so the issues of um, perceived intolerance in a very local community level, whether it be tied to tied to social conservative issues, it often emerged in rural Alberta. I'll be honest, as an issue where there's a tension between kids and their parents. In which the kids held very progressive values on issues and their parents did not. They were more conservative on social issues. And that's why the risk, obviously, in rural Alberta is what I call the stepping stone risk. What we saw in rural Alberta to a great extent is the data is, in fact, where they look at progressive communities that align to their values. If you're in Pincher Creek or Fort McMurray, you in fact look towards Calgary and Edmonton. That is your bastion of progressive places. And if you look at just our own city council elections in the last month, that in fact reflects the majority of the values of both those cities. So what we saw in rural Alberta is the stepping stone. Step one is from rural Alberta into urban Alberta. So, and again, a lot of that is driven by not just career opportunities. I think there's an obviousness to that, but I don't think that's actually the only factor. I think one of the dominant factors is alignment around values. But then what you see is amongst the high um, potential talent in urban areas, they then look at their next step of the stepping stone is actually Toronto and Vancouver. So they then, what we see in Calgary and Edmonton is a significant desire to move to metropolitan centers. And so you've got the stepping stone, Pincher to Calgary, Calgary to Vancouver is the logical stepping stone we often see.
Next question comes from Mary Shillington. Did you find differences in terms of gender?
No, gender, interestingly, did not play a significant role. It appeared in some factors, certainly, but we tested statistically for a variety of different factors, and gender did not play a dominant role. It emerged again in some areas, but it was at best secondary. It obviously emerged around some potential issues around values and so forth, or activities, but it wasn't a dominant factor compared to many of the others in the data set.
Knut Peterson, farming is a very big part of Alberta's economy, but it's not a big part of the workforce because of the mainly raw product export. Please explain the benefits of value added endeavors in terms of keeping people in Alberta.
No, it's a wonderful observation, and it's also, I think, a wonderful opportunity to look at the changing dynamic of an industry. And I don't pretend to be knowledgeable at all about agriculture or related sectors, but man, oh man, there are some really interesting innovation happening now in the ag sector that can create really fascinating career pathways in which it bridges both the emergence of what we're seeing from this younger cohort around the impacts of innovation technology to fundamentally reframe, create some efficiencies, create an industry that is far more environmentally conscious through the use of technology, and be able to bridge the two and say it's not an either or. This is not binary. The opportunity to follow your passion on the tech side to in fact build a better agricultural sector or biosector or energy sector is the convergence of the two. And there's been significant work in that over the last 20 years in this province, absolutely under the radar. It's not understood or recognized by any by very many young people at all. And those are the future opportunities, I think, that we start blending the quote unquote traditional economy with the new economy.
Our last question of the day comes from Bev Mundell. Was there a difference on the data gathered while the NDP were in government in Alberta versus the UCP?
No, boy, oh boy, I would love that data. One of the things we're constrained by is access to the data. And when the data was collected, there's been no study of this nature before. Only other data that we found that was relevant was the city of Calgary collected data in 2020 on this topic, but we've got no longitudinal data. So I can't tell you what it was like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But that's a systemic problem. Marketers look at trends. Marketers know they need to collect data over time to understand the impact of interventions. Did this campaign work? Did this product design work? Did this distribution channel work? And I can start looking at the impacts of those interventions or investments by simply looking at the trend data over time and when the intervention happened. With no longitudinal data, we are just throwing stuff against the wall and hoping something sticks. And that's where I say, if we were looking at this systematically and strategically and actually had a chief talent officer in place, that's the type of data we collect, the type of interventions we then look at and look at the return on those interventions. Without that, it's random and ad hoc, and that's just not sustainable and would lead to poor outcomes.
Laura Schultz, David, thank you for an overview of this fascinating research. Mark Goodall, very interesting study, many thanks. Ian Hurdle, many thanks. And also on behalf of SACPA, I really like to thank you for this very fascinating talk and for your time today. Before we wrap up our session, do you have a take-home message for our viewers, please?
This problem is all our problem. So it's easy for us to defer and say that's the government's responsibility, that's the university or the college responsibility, it's the curriculum on high school, it's the political party's responsibility. No, it's not. It's our responsibility. It starts at home. It starts at home with our own children and our own their friends and their family and our community. We can have impact at the most grassroots level, and I would argue the greatest impact we can have is at home. So social networks matter. What we're seeing is contagion matters. The minute things get perceived as negative at a local level, it spreads, and that creates this tidal wave of negativity, which then leads to this mass outward migration. Start and take control, be accountable to our own communities.
Wonderful. Bev Mundell, Knut Peterson, Jim Miller, all thank you very much. So lots of thank yous in the queue. Folks, join us next week with Connie Marie Reed-Hubble. Are you a senior who's feeling lonely? Would you like someone to keep in touch with you? That is next week, Thursday. And thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you again for David for being with us.
Thanks, Alice.